Catherine Amir Farr.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of International Law Behind the Headlines. I'm Cal Raustiala, and I'm really grateful to have on the podcast for this episode a friend and colleague within ASIL, Leila Sadat. Leila is professor at WashU Law School. She is James Carr Professor of International Criminal Law, and for about a decade was special advisor to the ICC prosecutor on crimes against humanity. Leila's written and researched issues around the use of force in criminal law for many years. And so I asked her to come on the podcast to talk about a number of issues that maybe can be lumped under the rubric of extraterritorial killings, snatchings, criminal acts, and things of that nature. I had in mind, in particular, the recent example of the dispute between India and Canada that's currently ongoing. We're recording this at the end of November. That's still ongoing about whether India had directly killed a Canadian citizen with regard to Sikh nationalism within India. But of course, there are many other examples. So I thought Leila would be the perfect person. So Leila, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here, Cal.
Yeah, great to have you on. And so with that brief introduction, I guess the first question I have for you is just maybe how unusual or how would you characterize the kind of universe of cases that are akin to the India-Canada dispute that I just discussed? And is that something that you see a lot of, or just give us a sense of what to how to characterize this?
Thanks so much for the question. It was a pretty shocking case, right? Because the individual is living their life in Canada, they're a Canadian citizen, and all of a sudden they're murdered by individuals living in Canada. And it turns out that the allegation is that the Indian government was actually behind the execution because the activist, Nijar, was somebody who was involved in this Sikh separatist, the Sikh independence campaign, this Khalistan referendum. So one would hope that it wasn't true, but it looks increasingly likely that this was in fact the case. There was an individual living in New York City that was warned by the FBI that he was also likely to be targeted for assassination. So U.S. officials have also had to become very aware of this extrajudicial activity by what looks like the government of India across borders with respect to the Sikh nationalists. So this is a pretty scary idea because, of course, you could have others injured or harmed in addition to the individual killed. And the idea of individuals working for foreign governments operating on the territory of your state is pretty scary. So we would hope it was an isolated incident, but unfortunately, we are seeing an increase of this worldwide.
So thank you. That's a great way to frame it. And I guess just to kind of break down the legal structure here, how we should begin to think about this question. It would seem like we started off with an example where someone's actually, perhaps, again, we don't know all the details, but let's posit that they were in fact assassinated by the Indian government. So that's the most extreme. And then we also seem to have examples of kidnappings, and maybe even just at the very end of that spectrum, examples of just simply extraterritorial law enforcement that's maybe done in a lawful way. So can you give us a sense of kind of how to think about that spectrum from lawful to unlawful, extraterritorial / extrajudicial acts? How should we think about that spectrum?
Well, I think the way we typically think of the rules of international law, particularly when a state is conducting its foreign policy through its diplomats and through its embassies, is everybody's supposed to follow the rules, right? That's kind of the norm. And the norm is that when a state has an issue with a particular individual or foreign policy, it should go through peaceful diplomatic channels. There are a variety of mechanisms open to states in order to achieve their foreign policy objectives. But particularly with respect to dissenters living abroad, we've now seen the Russian Federation, Iran. In the Jamal Khashoggi case, we saw an individual who was dismembered and killed. We think at the behest of the Saudi government. And now we have this case involving India and potentially others. So we're really starting to see a lot of states just engaging in self-help. And it's very violent self-help. We're seeing kidnappings, we're seeing hostage takings, we're seeing executions on foreign soil. So getting a hold of this and dampening it down, I think, is something that should be a top priority for any peace-loving government, because obviously these tit for tats can really spiral out of control.
Yes, yes. So is there anything unlawful or any rules that govern, let's say, simply the declaration of that acts that are extraterritorial can be criminal? So, in other words, if the Indian government wanted to say that espousing Sikh separatism, Sikh nationalism, espousing the idea of a separate Khalistan state is itself a criminal act anywhere it happens in the world. Are there any limitations on simply that assertion, putting aside whether they actually act on that assertion?
Well, that's so interesting you say that. So, the normal process, if a state has a criminal law that it says is being violated by one of its nationals abroad, the state could seek extradition of
Mm-hmm.
that individual, which would be the appropriate legal means to obtain their presence for trial. Iran actually has been conducting trials in absentia of Iranian dissidents living abroad and has actually sought Interpol red notices with respect to some of those individuals. Now, should those red notices be given, right? Because a lot of this is just suppressing opinions you don't like.
Right.
And we do have rules about double criminality. We have rules that extradition can be refused for political offenses. But there is actually a process. If a state believes one of its citizens has committed an offense abroad, there is an extradition process, assuming that there are treaties linking the two countries together. So we have legal ways of dealing with these kind of issues. Dispatching agents onto the territory of another state to kidnap the individual or kill them is not legal. So that's why Canada, in the case we're talking about, Canada expelled 6 Indian diplomats. Can't prosecute them because they have immunity, but they were expelled. And then India expelled 6 Canadians in return.
Right, right. So presumably India could have approached the Canadian government as you described. I don't know whether they have a mutual legal assistance treaty or an extradition framework, but if they had, they could have done that. But also presumably Canada would have refused on either the political prong that you mentioned or perhaps some kind of free expression rationale within Canadian law. I'm not really sure. Is that your sense that Canada
Yeah,
would
I mean,
participate?
Justin Trudeau has said very clearly that he believes that the Sikh separatists do have the right to engage in political advocacy in Canada under their equivalent of the First Amendment. So the Canadian government has been clear that they're not going to be the ones implementing India's policy of suppressing Sikhs speaking abroad. Iranian activists, a lot of what has been happening with women in Iran, we have activists living abroad trying to, garner support for women in Iran, and the Iranian government has targeted them extraterritorially with threats. Syria has been targeting in Syrians living abroad with threats, and we believe there have actually been assassinations. And Russia might be the best known country of doing this. They killed basically their political
Yes.
opposition leader, Navalny, with poisoning abroad.
Yes, yes. So just to kind of, I guess, continue down this road about what could a state do, and again, I'm not in any way endorsing these activities, which are really kind of heinous and shocking in many ways, but it does make me think, if you're India and you're concerned about this activity, and again, I don't think there's any evidence that they tried to use the lawful channels you described. But if they had and they were rebuffed, or they simply knew that they would be rebuffed, then what are their options? And I guess it makes me think of the kind of unable and unwilling debate that occurs as well within international law about terrorist activities or other harms. If a local jurisdiction is unable or unwilling to suppress that harm, at least the United States and a few other countries assert, well, we can go in and deal with it. Is this sort of the same thing, or how would you distinguish it?
Well, that's a super interesting analogy. The Sikh independence movement says, and I'm not an expert on this, but I did a little research on it. They are a peaceful movement. They're not advocating violence. The Indian
Yes, absolutely.
government has labeled them to be terrorists, so that's an improper label because terrorism is violence for a political purpose, and they're nonviolent. So the unable or unwilling to me doesn't work very well. I think what India has to do is it has to be willing to live with the fact that people disagree with Indian policy. And as we know, even from the secession of Quebec case out of the Canadian Supreme Court, that when there is a group within a country that is advocating for for separatism, right, for secession, the job of the country is basically to accommodate the interests of that group sufficiently so that they feel that they can live comfortably within that larger state. International law disfavors secessionist tendencies. It favors stability and sovereignty. So what India really needs to do is peacefully negotiate with its Sikh minority so that they feel comfortable living in Greater India. What's interesting about that case is Canada's Supreme Court did say that if there had been a vote to secede, which there never was, there were sort of referendum, but they never voted to secede, that it would entail a constitutional duty to negotiate on behalf of the government in Ottawa. So really the way to deal with separatism is peacefully negotiating, accommodating, promoting tolerance, all the good things that we like to see. Because taking hardline positions or trying to chase the activists around the world and either shut them down in various ways or even target them for execution is actually liable to bring about the very violence that India fears. So that would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And again, just want to underscore, I'm only posing this at kind of at a high level of abstraction. If you accept the Indian government's position that these Sikh separatists, of which there are many in Canada, my understanding is Canada has maybe the largest population of Sikhs outside of India, and it's a not insignificant group within Canada. But if you believe the Indian government that they're terrorists, which again, there isn't really evidence for, but from their standpoint, it starts to look a little bit like assertions that the US government or other Western governments have made in the past. But obviously, the facts are crucial to that analogy. Either way, it seems like there isn't really, even if you accept that it's something akin, let's say they were terrorists, but if you accept that, the unable or unwilling standard is not widely accepted within international law. So I guess even with that, it's not clear that India has any choice other than to follow the procedures that you began with. In other words, the lawful extradition / Interpol driven procedures. What they can never do is simply operate on Canadian soil as law enforcement agents of their own. Is that accurate?
Exactly. And let's say, if we spin out the hypothetical a little further, India is so frustrated with this. They've tried their negotiations, they're doing everything, and they really feel that this separatist group operating on the territory of another state is actually destabilizing their country, right? Let's assume all of those things. One of the interesting things is whether Canada would eventually bear some responsibility if there was actual destabilization or actual violence. In this situation, none of that is true. So I think it's really challenging for the Indian government, but I think the best thing for the Indian government really is to ratchet down their approach, not ratchet it up, because the more aggressive their tactics are, the more aggressive the response is going to be from the very individuals that they feel are not sort of living peaceably within their state.
Right.
Canada is going to protect the human rights of all Canadian citizens under Canadian law. So India operating extraterritorially on Canadian territory is simply going to be unacceptable.
Yeah, agreed. Certainly would be unacceptable to us here in the United States. And I know that the Canadian government is understandably, quite irate about this, as indicated by, their expulsion of six diplomats. So let's pivot to that, to the sort of reactions that a state like Canada can take when, again, assuming that the Canadian account is accurate. I just want to emphasize that India is not accepting that responsibility, but there does seem to be evidence, and so let's assume it's true that Indian agents of some kind assassinated a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil. What can Canada do in response? They've already removed ordered out a set of diplomats. What other actions are possible?
Well, Canada has actually charged three individuals with the crime that was committed, which is murder. However you want to slice or dice it,
Right.
it is a murder. So they have actually brought criminal charges against individuals who don't have diplomatic immunity. The challenge for the Canadian government is that I assume that the individuals expelled really would have immunity under international law and under the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. And so Canada is sort of stuck there. They're not stuck with respect to all individuals working at the embassy, right, or the consular officials, but they're pretty stuck with respect to high-ranking individuals. What we've seen some states do when they feel there has been inappropriate action taken is they go to the International Court of Justice. So now I'm thinking of Mexico granting gloss asylum and Ecuador storming the Mexican embassy in Quito to take prisoner, right, and
Yeah.
take back their individual who'd been granted asylum, and beat up Mexico's diplomats in the process. And what Mexico has done is it's gone to the International Court of Justice under the Pact of Bogota, which provides a jurisdiction. So I think juridical action between states, if Canada can find a way to bring India to court for violating its territorial sovereignty, I think that is something Canada can do.
Yeah. And just to clarify on the diplomats, I'm not sure, this is just based on reporting that I've read. I'm not sure that Canada has either asserted or has any evidence that those particular diplomats had some actual role in the murder, but rather it could simply be, again, I think we don't know. It's a common practice of states to say, we're unhappy about something that happened, and so we're going to expel some diplomats, regardless of whether those particular
Exactly.
do with it. We're simply, this is a show of displeasure. And, six is a big number. So, it's a big show of displeasure, but it's also possible that they actually did play a role because some of the Canadian assertions seem to go possibly all the way up to Modi himself or very close to Modi. But again, that's just all allegations in the press. I don't have any particular knowledge. So you mentioned judicial proceedings in the ICJ. Any other lawful or simply, let's say, political actions that Canada can take to either register its dissent or in fact somehow try to rectify the situation?
Well, obviously, the best thing is for the two countries to sit down at the table and work this out. But it reminds me a little bit of the Rainbow Warrior case as well, right? When France blew up the Rainbow Warrior in New Zealand's harbor, killing an individual there. Obviously, we ended up with a tremendous diplomatic row between France and New Zealand that required the Secretary General's mediation. So having the Secretary General or some high-ranking individual attempt to mediate the dispute could be useful. And the thing that was so interesting in the Rainbow Warrior case, right, was that the arbitration agreement, because France didn't really comply with the original settlement, and there were a whole series of things that were that were suggested in the original arbitration, mediation by the Secretary General, and then the arbitration came up with others. An apology could be issued by India for violating Canadian sovereignty if they would do that. There was a special fund that was created to promote amicable relations between the two states. France and New Zealand really almost went down the path of a trade war because France was so angry about the arrest of its agents, who clearly had actually blown up the ship in New Zealand's harbor. And France was so angry that they were slapping tariffs on New Zealand products that were critical for New Zealand's economy. So France sort of had more leverage in the dispute. So one hopes that Canada and India don't get into a trade war, but I'm sure that the Canadians have some degree of ability to leverage with India and vice versa. These are two fairly powerful countries in a way.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's an interesting case to bring up. I'm glad you raised that. So let me ask you, you alluded to this a little bit in the beginning, but the idea that maybe this sort of extraterritorial action, let's call it, whether it's kidnapping or assassination, that this is really on the rise, and that we see many examples in recent years compared to the past. So is that your sense, that this is actually something that's becoming increasingly common?
Yeah, unfortunately, Cal, it is, as we're seeing so much slippage in international law with norms we thought were well established, like, Ecuador storming Mexico's embassy, right, to grab somebody there. And the United States, in fact, created the Office of the Special Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs because so many Americans were being taken hostage abroad. I mentioned Brittany Griner and the Wall Street Journalist. Those are some of the most significant cases, but we've had individuals arrested by China. 2 Canadians were arrested as sort of a tit for tat because China had brought criminal proceedings against a high-level executive of a Chinese company. We're seeing a lot of individuals, U.S. citizens, being basically taken hostage, mostly with false or what we call wrongful detention. That is, the criminal charges really don't fit what actually happened, and they're being used as sort of a political wedge or political leverage against the United States. And we used to have this policy that, of course, we wouldn't negotiate, especially if it was terrorist organizations. And now we're actually seeing lots of trades, and there's this new office of the special envoy. And I understand the UK is going to create a similar office because they're also experiencing a rise in individuals who are wrongfully detained or taken hostage abroad.
No, just to clarify, some of those cases, like I believe this is the case with Brittany Griner, but I don't know for sure. She was in Russia at the time and was seized on maybe let's call it a trumped up charge. That certainly seems to be the through line in what you described. But in a lot of those cases, the individual in question is on the territory of the state that is asserting a criminal act of some kind, rather than, like in the Canadian case, the state is acting on someone else's territory. Is that right?
Exactly. And we're seeing sort of all themes and variations. There was an example of a Chinese intelligence agent who allegedly kidnapped a prominent Swedish national publisher and spirited them away to China because they were publishing books relating to Chinese dissidents, essentially. So we've seen sort of all the themes and variations. What I'd say links it together is that it's, in a way, state-sponsored violence. Because a wrongful detention really is an act of violence. It's an arbitrary arrest and detention under human rights law. So Brittany Griner, we would call wrongfully detained, but that is state violence being used against her. And it was part of Russian hostage diplomacy because they managed to get Victor Bout, who they really wanted, traded for her, and a notorious arms trafficker, right, that the United States had. So it's this hostage diplomacy where individuals are just sort of caught up in violence being implemented by a state.
Yes, yes. It also makes me think of a story that I recall from a year or two ago. And again, I don't know how accurate this is, but that the Chinese government, the People's Republic, was sort of operating a kind of police operation in New York. It had a sort of police station, unofficial, unauthorized. Again, I'm just sort of resurrecting this from my memory, but I know on college campuses, including my own, there does seem to be increasing discussion of the ways that the Chinese Communist Party is enforcing rules and, let's say, norms of speech and behavior against Chinese students who are studying here in the United States. So this is starting to drift a little further away from criminal acts to simply, disfavored acts, let's say. But they could include criminal acts. And certainly operating a kind of rogue police force on the territory of another state is unlawful. So it does seem like these activities are multiplying and maybe going in many different directions, kind of metastasizing in a lot of different ways.
I totally agree with you. We've seen countries like Vietnam, grab the Vietnamese grabbed somebody out of Berlin, and it was a Vietnamese national who they were targeting. Bangkok has done it. And so I think there's a copycat phenomenon here. And it seems as if states would do well to have a conference and stop it, because the United States, when we kidnapped Alvarez Machain, and we thought we were super justified by doing that rather than request extradition from Mexico. I think you remember that case, right?
Yeah,
it was a terrible case. And when we think we're the only ones doing it, we're like, well, but we're the good guys, so if we do it occasionally, it's not so bad. But now we're seeing it proliferate around the world, and we're starting to have our own citizens targeted as well. And it is obviously this kind of extrajudicial behavior by states is something that can lead to a very violent and sort of unsafe world.
Agreed. Well, this is definitely a conversation that we'll circle back to, I'm sure, in years to come. And I really want to thank you, Leila, for coming on the podcast and discussing these issues. So I hope we can have you back soon.
Thanks for having me, Cal. It was great.
Take care.